됐나요?
Yeah.
Welcome. Pleasure to meet you all at the 2020 online lecture series on Understanding World Heritage Interpretation and Presentation. Thank you all for joining the second lecture of the lecture series. This is Subin Cho, and I'm a project consultant of the Preparatory Office for the International Center for the Interpretation and Presentation of the World Heritage Sites under the auspices of UNESCO. The significance of World Heritage interpretation and presentation is increasing for a better understanding on the value of World Heritage and the need for protecting them. Therefore, the Preparatory Office for the Centre is opening the online lecture series in cooperation with Korean Cultural Heritage Administration. The 2020 online lecture series will be held twice a month until 26 November 2020. The opening lecture was on last Thursday. Please check the video of the lecture, Introduction to World Heritage Interpretation, on our Facebook page and YouTube channel. Today, we will have the second lecture with Dr. William Logan, and there will be 4 more lectures with World Heritage professionals. Please take a look at the Facebook page of the Preparatory Office for further information on the lectures. Before we start today's lecture, if you have any questions about the lecture, please leave comments on our YouTube or Facebook's live streaming video. We will have time for questions after having the lecture. Now, I would like to give a brief introduction to our lecturer, Dr. William Logan. William Logan is a professor emeritus at Deakin University, where he was previously UNESCO Chair of Heritage and Urbanism. He has undertaken UNESCO and e-commerce missions to Bangladesh, China, Laos, Pakistan, and Vietnam. He was a member of the team that drafted UNESCO's World Heritage and Sustainable Development Policy and was an invited expert at the consultative meeting on cultural rights at the UN Human Rights Commission, Geneva, in 2011, where he also addressed the Human Rights Council. Within Australia, he was a member of the Victorian Heritage Council and president of Australia E-Commerce. He co-edited the Routledge Key Issues in Cultural Heritage book series, and he is a member of the editorial board of the International Journal of Heritage Studies. Now, I would like to turn the time over to our lecturer, Dr. William Logan. Pleasure to meet you, Dr. William Logan.
Thank you, Sabine. I'm delighted to be here. Thank you very much for your invitation. I'm especially delighted because this is your first public event from your centre. I wish your centre every success in the future. Now, my paper is entitled, if we can get the share screen just a moment, I'll put this on. That's it. Okay, my paper, the paper I was asked to talk about is UNESCO's World Heritage Listing and Heritage Interpretation. So it builds on Neil Silverman's lecture last week, but it differs in a number of important ways. I'm focusing on UNESCO's World Heritage Project and how it works and how it might work better in relation to site interpretation. Site interpretation, of course, is fundamental to the World Heritage Project. The idea of outstanding universal value is, of course, an interpretation, and we're always dealing with associative values, you know, things that are interpretations of historic places. I see the World Heritage Project in the context of UNESCO's constitution, especially its overriding goal of building bridges to peace. And also in the context of UNESCO's governance arrangements. especially its character as an intergovernment organisation, an IGO, which gives power to the states parties to the World Heritage Convention. So in a way, nation states run things. They haven't fizzled out, as we predicted quite incorrectly back in the 1980s and 90s when there were global organisations and companies developing. Nation states today seem as powerful as ever. My paper sets the operation of the World Heritage Project into a geopolitical context as well. That is, the changing international relations between states that lead national governments to make use of cultural heritage in political ways, which means they have great interest in and commonly seek to shape the interpretation of their national cultural heritage, and often misrepresent the cultural heritage of other states. Neil's and my papers are both future-oriented. Neil's highlighting ideas and technologies supporting community engagement in heritage tourism, and mine today focusing more on World Heritage listing processes of site nomination and inscription and how these might be improved in the future. But first, let's go back and look at the definitions. What would he mean by heritage interpretation? Why it's so important, and what are some of its failings in practice? So these are the two definitions, two terms, in fact, presentation and the interpretation, that are often interchanged as if they meant the same thing. In fact, they don't. They're quite different. Let's clarify them. These are the interpretations on your screen that were developed by the ICOMOS International Committee on Interpretation and Presentation of Cultural Heritage Sites, usually referred to by the acronym ICIP. Neil referred to these definitions. I mean, he was chair of that committee for many, many years. I want to put a different emphasis on them. You can see there in the definition, presentation denotes the carefully planned arrangement of information and physical access to a cultural heritage site, usually by scholars, design firms, heritage professionals. As such, it's largely a one-way mode of communication. Interpretation, on the other hand, denotes the totality of activity, reflection, research, and creativity stimulated by a cultural heritage site. And the definition goes on and talks about the need for inclusive views of the past, incorporating these into our understanding about the site, and how you might use the site and its interpretation as valuable resources for sustainable community development and dialogue between various cultures and between generations. So far, so good. For me, interpretation is a critical element in all programs aimed at protecting heritage places. It's interpretation that links a site as it exists with those who see and think about it, that is, visitors, seeing the sites in person or viewing them online or reading about them in books and brochures. Interpretation enables visitors to make sense of the place. Interpretation, at least for me, is essentially about meaning. It's the intellectual content that is provided about a site. There are, of course, as many interpretations as there are visitors. As Neil says, it's impossible to define or even predict what kind of reaction a particular site will evoke in a visitor. Expert interpretation is only one side of the heritage dialogue. Each visitor makes his or her own interpretation of even the most polished story. While we should encourage visitors to contribute to such content, in most cases, site managers arrange for particular versions of site significance to be presented. In doing this, the site managers normally describe their sites in ways that fit the government-approved national narrative. There's no guarantee that the official interpretation will match what lies in the visitor's heart and mind. From this, it's clear that further research needs to be done on how interpretations form in people's mind and how this can be utilised by site managers to improve interpretation and presentation plans for their sites. Site interpretation, however, is not well developed in many sites around the world, and site managers would benefit from external assistance to lift standards. Greater effort especially needs to go into making the intellectual content accessible to visitors who have a non-technical interest in the site and who want the site to be set into a broad historical and geographical context. Many visitors are put off when the only narrative provided about a site is ideology-bound and propagandistic. There are heightened difficulties interpreting sites in countries still in post-conflict mode. Indeed, the interpretation and presentation sometimes exacerbate tensions persisting from the past. Further work also needs to be done, therefore, on the interpretation of the many places that are associated with recent conflicts. I'm particularly interested in this personally, no doubt reflecting my initial disciplinary training as a political geographer. Of course, we know that the memories of an international civil conflict do not end with the ceasefire. They continue on and become an important element of the intangible cultural heritage that we must now consider in World Heritage nomination and management practices, including site interpretation. When places are remembered differently by countries that were previously in open conflict, nationalistic interpretation commonly reinforces divisions and maintains or even increases tensions. Tensions are not only between states, but also between communities within states. There are now many case studies demonstrating the blatant replacement of minority cultures by the majority culture, commonly with governments using the pretext of seeking national cohesion, but disregarding the abuse of human rights that is involved. UNESCO's World Heritage Committee has had to deal with many disputes between states over the nomination and inscription of sites related to international conflicts. When former belligerents seek to have a say in the management of sites outside their own jurisdiction, that is, extraterritorial sites of heritage significance to them, considerable diplomatic involvement is required to reach solutions that meet the satisfaction of all sides. This takes vast amounts of time, energy, and funding on the part of UNESCO, the states parties and their diplomats, as well as heritage policymakers and site managers. Serious international disputes of this kind have erupted in recent years in numerous parts of the world, impacting on listing processes. In this presentation, because of the shortness of time, I'm going to look at just 3 case studies: East Asia, the region, essentially in this presentation, Korea and Japan, Rwanda in Africa, and Sri Lanka in South Asia. Similar conflicts exist, by the way, in other parts of UNESCO's overall heritage project, in the inscription of intangible and documentary heritage on the representative list of the intangible cultural heritage of humanity and the Memory of the World Register. These sometimes connect with the focus of today's talk, World Heritage, the listing of places of so-called outstanding universal value on the World Heritage List. So let's look first at East Asia. In East Asia, the clearest example of World Heritage site interpretation raising tensions is the sites of Japan's Meiji Industrial Revolution. Although the Koguryo tombs and city relics were also problematic when they were inscribed in 2004. When the Japanese Meiji Industrial Revolution serial sites were nominated to the World Heritage Committee at its 2015 session in Bonn, the Republic of Korea refused to support it because of the forced labour issue, which had been omitted from the nomination. A closed side meeting led to a compromise that allowed the inscription to proceed. Site interpretation was, as you'll see, absolutely central to the agreement. When approving the nomination, the committee requested the preparation of, quoting, an interpretive strategy for the presentation of the property that would allow an understanding of the full history of each component site. The committee also requested Japan to make a progress report in 2 years' time. In its progress report, Japan skirted the forced labour issue, indicating only that an interpretation strategy had been developed and that the views of independent international experts had been taken into account, as well as the specific advice of the ICOMOS International Scientific Committee on Interpretation and Presentation, ICIP. That specific advice was on what the word a full history of each site might mean. When the committee considered Japan's report at its 42nd session in 2018, the committee accepted that sufficient interpretation was available digitally for all site components and that there would be a single information centre located in Tokyo, by the way, rather than on the sites themselves. However, the committee strongly encouraged, and I'm again quoting, strongly encouraged the state party to take into account best international practices for interpretation strategies when continuing its work on the interpretation of the full history of the property, both during and outside the period covered by its OUV. The period of the property's OUV is the Meiji period, 1868 to 1912, but the committee was asking the interpretation strategy to go wider, to include the forced labour issue dating from the colonial period and the World War II period as part of the full history. Japan's second State of Conservation report was posted on UNESCO's website on the 2nd of December 2019. And again, no mention was made of the forced labour matter. The South Korean Foreign Minister responded immediately, urging Japan to faithfully implement the follow-up measures, calling for renewed dialogue on the matter, and threatening to raise the issue with the World Heritage Centre and the UNESCO Executive Board. This controversy, you can see, alongside that around the comfort women dispute at the Memory of the World Register, have led to a rupture in the public of Korea-Japan relations with enormous political, economic and social consequences for both countries. But returning to the committee's decision, what is meant by the reference to the best international practices for interpretation strategies? This is unclear. Several agencies have the potential to set such a standard, including the committee itself. At the moment, however, the committee's operational guidelines for the implementation of the World Heritage Convention are very quiet on interpretation, the term being used to mean techniques for presenting information to tourists and other visitors. Nothing is said about the intellectual content, about ensuring its accuracy and its balance. Two of the ICOMOS International Scientific Committees, ICIP, I've already mentioned, and the International Committee on Fortifications and Military Heritage, ICOFORT, could also take up the challenge to develop best practice interpretation for conflict-related places. And the International Centre for Interpretation Presentation of World Heritage Sites in Korea, host of today's lecture, should also make this a focus of its site work. The geopolitical significance of the Rwanda case is also clear and also changing over time. The case fits to my earlier comment that tensions not only exist between states, but also between communities within states. In Rwanda, commemoration relates to the slaughter of between 0.5 and 1 million Tutsi, Twa and moderate Hutu that took place in April to July in 1994. It's commonly known as, referred to as the Tutsi genocide. Because Rwanda did not have a monumental tradition, when commemoration practices began, they focused on the bodies of the dead. Eventually, however, attention was turned to preserving the main genocide sites, and 4 of these, Nyamata, Morambi, Bisesero, and Kazosi, were submitted to the World Heritage Tentative List in 2012. The United Nations and several Western states, notably the United States, United Kingdom, and especially France, have been accused of providing material support to the Hutu perpetrators of the genocide. Rwanda moved out of the French orbit and joined the Commonwealth, the organisation that grew out of the British Empire. English has replaced French as the main foreign language taught in schools. Continuing difficult relations with those states may complicate the Rwandan serial sites translation from the tentative list to the World Heritage List. We've yet to see. Within Rwanda, inscription may also heighten existing tensions with the remaining Hutu people. The good news, however, is that there appears to have been a significant movement in the official Rwandan attitude since around 2010. While the genocide remains a foundational element of the Rwandan nation, it has been shifted aside and reconciliation is now at the heart of the memorial process. What does this mean for site interpretation in Rwanda? Is there a Hutu view of 1994 that should be incorporated? Or should Colin Long and Kia Reeves' admonition with regard to the growth of Khmer Rouge devotion at Anglong Veng in Cambodia be borne in mind in the Rwandan and similar cases? Their view on the screen there. If the purpose of heritage preservation in the case of places of pain and shame is to commemorate the victims, then there's little role for the preservation of perpetrator sites. Heritage preservation is not about preserving all of the past. It's about remembering aspects of the past which we believe worthy of remembrance. So we might bear that in mind, is my point. As in Rwanda, recent scholarship in and on Sri Lanka suggests that a shifting interpretation strategy at the national level seems to be working towards reconciliation there, in this case between the two cultural groups engaged in the country's long-running civil war that went from 1983 to 2009, the Buddhist Sinhalese majority and the Hindu Tamil minority. One study published this year by Samaratanga and others explains how in the immediate post-war years, Sinhalese tourists flocked northward to gaze upon war remnants, creating dark tourism in Jaffna and the northern province. Gradually over the last decade, however, the national government and the military have been systematically removing the dark tourism attractions, and subsequently the dark tourist gaze has begun shifting towards a more conventional tourist gaze. Sri Lanka also offers some exemplary cases of sites related to recent conflicts that have been sensitively interpreted in order to mollify rather than exacerbate lingering tensions. The Temple of the Sacred Tooth, which was World Heritage listed as part of the sacred city of Kandy in 1988, was attacked by terrorists a decade later. Although no one has claimed responsibility for the attack, it was seen to be linked to the civil war. 11 people were killed in the attack, 23 wounded, and serious ethnic riots and revenge destruction of Hindu religious buildings followed. Major restoration was required, and interpretation of the incident was problematic. The heritage architect responsible for the restorations, Gamini Wijesuria, who's presenting later in this online lecture series, explained to me during a site visit last December that while not attempting to erase memory of the attack, it was seen as important not to highlight the attack or to detract from the religious narrative for which the site had been inscribed. The solution was to place some of the remains of a principal gate that had been badly damaged in the bomb in a small garden beside the temple's main pavilion. This cross-cultural sensitivity was extended and became more proactive with Sudarsan Senavaratne's concept of using Sri Lanka's heritage resources for conflict resolution, arguing that unless and until we learn to present the past by incorporate all communities as its stakeholders and develop an unbiased historical explanation of the past, it, site interpretation, in other words, will only alienate different groups for different reasons. And he put his ideas into practice at the sacred city of Anuradhapura World Heritage Site when he was the archaeological director there. So I want to turn now to ways that we might learn from these lessons and come up with some ideas about raising the status of site interpretation in World Heritage listing process, inscription processes. One can assume that resolving tensions around the listing of sites related to recent conflicts is not something that UNESCO's Director General and the World Heritage Centre personnel want to do, especially given UNESCO's straitened financial situation following the United States' decision to withdraw and take its money with it. How can the enormous drain on their time and energy be avoided in future? The international tensions over how the past should be interpreted, memory contests, as a Japanese colleague Yoko Nakano calls this, these tensions have had enormous negative consequences for the countries involved, including trade embargoes and import boycotts, court cases, street demonstrations. How can the interpretation of World Heritage Sites help to minimise such consequences and to engender more peaceful regions and the world? Well, firstly, UNESCO, by which in fact, I mean, people tend to reify UNESCO as if it's a single body. It's not, as we would say. In fact, I'm talking about the World Heritage Committee and its Secretariat, the World Heritage Centre, need to determine and publicise and promote the principles to be used in accepting sites for nomination to the tentative list and the World Heritage List. Training of heritage bureaucrats and site managers will certainly be required in this, and also professionals working in the private sector, companies and agencies. This has become really quite urgent, as the number of sites related to recent conflicts being considered for listing has grown rapidly. Until 2010, only 3 such sites had been World Heritage listed. There were others, of course, relating to conflicts in the much more distant past, but in terms of recent ones, the 3 were Auschwitz-Birkenau in 1979, Hiroshima Peace Memorial, 1996, and the Bikini Atoll nuclear site in 2010. And none of these were listed without controversies of one kind or another. By 2018, however, 11 new nominations have been tabled, 2 for the World Heritage List and 9 for the tentative lists. The anticipation of further trouble in its sessions led the World Heritage Committee to impose a temporary halt in processing nominations until a comprehensive reflection on all relevant issues could be undertaken by a meeting of experts. Notice expert. The committee would then decide at its 44th session in 2020 whether and how sites associated with recent conflicts and other negative and divisive memories might relate to the purpose and scope of the World Heritage Convention. So clearly this is going to be an important moment that will give us some clues as to how we might go forward in relation to conflict-related sites. We'll see what transpires when the 44th session eventually takes place. The meeting, as you no doubt know, was scheduled for mid-2020 in Fuzhou, China, but's been postponed due to the pandemic. With regard to developing interpretation strategies that foster reconciliation, some positive changes have in fact been occurring already, some driven by tensions directly flowing out of the conflicts themselves. A dispute in October 2015 in the Memory of the World sphere has overlapping consequences. This was a dispute between China and Japan over the inclusion of Chinese documents relating to the 1937 Nanjing massacre. When those documents were included on the MOW register, Japan held its obligatory dues of around $30 million US, which is a major issue given that the US had already withdrawn money and Japan was one of, if not the main funder at that point. This really forced the UNESCO Executive Board to take a stand and to adopt a resolution in October 2017 calling on UNESCO to seek to avoid aggravating political tensions among member states in line with its fundamental aim of working towards mutual understanding. Some revisions have been made to the operational guidelines for the implementation of the World Heritage Convention to incorporate UNESCO's 2015 World Heritage and Sustainable Development Policy. This policy brings into the heritage field the United Nations 2030 Sustainable Development Agenda and Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs, relating to a whole range of things, including human rights, peace and security, inclusive economic and social development, gender equity, indigenous rights, among others. In my view, the revisions of the operational guidelines don't go far enough yet, particularly in relation to human rights and peace and security, but there is movement that way. What else might the World Heritage Committee do? It might do more to set international best practice in site interpretation by adjusting its own inscription and monitoring processes. It's been steadily tightening up the inscription process since the early 1990s in requiring clearer, more complete management plans, and since 2005, specific statements of outstanding universal value, or retrospective statements of outstanding universal value for existing inscriptions. It's perhaps time to include an interpretation plan for existing properties, or a retrospective interpretation plan. Sorry, the other way around. Include an interpretation plan for new nominations, and for existing properties, a retrospective interpretation plan. Such an interpretation plan should follow the kind of ideas I've been talking about, the ideas in the 2015 policy and the UN agenda and so on. The plan should not only elaborate on the significance of the heritage sites from the nominating states' parties' point of view, but also set the site into an international context, and where it's a site related to recent conflict, tell the various sides of the site's history and highlight a message of reconciliation and peace. With such an interpretation in plan in hand, the advisory bodies will be able to help states parties ensure before their dossiers get to the committee that they are consistent with UNESCO principles and policies and are not going to exacerbate tension. This would fit neatly with the new preliminary assessment mechanism adopted at the committee's 43rd session last year in Baku, Azerbaijan. In line with the World Heritage and Sustainable Development Policy, the committee could give priority to nominations that move away from the promotion of the nation to the promotion of dialogue and peace. Transboundary nominations, for instance, would fit this category. It should also move to ensure a strong emphasis on interpretation in all forms of monitoring, including periodic monitoring, reactive monitoring, and so on. Now, I just want to end with a slight reality check. While academics and other professionals can promote change, as I'm doing, we need to be aware that we're working within a context, a governance context, particularly, that constrains us. How successful efforts to reform World Heritage listing procedures and practice will ultimately depend not on UNESCO or the World Heritage Committee, but on the member states, to UNESCO or the states parties to the convention. UNESCO and the committee are both intergovernmental organisations made up of these member states and state parties that jealously guard their independence and their right to put national interests first. UNESCO and the committee are dependent on the goodwill and cooperation of their members. They can monitor World Heritage activities, but they have little power to enforce. UNESCO's chief mode of operation is to inspire, that is to challenge and encourage its member states to manage their heritage sites, interpret them in ways that embrace peace and sustainable development, engage in intercultural dialogue, maintain the culture of their minorities, and in ways to go ahead with this in ways that avoid exacerbating problems, reviving or heightening tensions. Improving the interpretation of World Heritage sites interpretation is therefore fraught with difficulties, but constant pressure on the member states and the state parties may get us somewhere, may give us cause for hope. At that, I will end my lecture. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Professor. We really appreciate for your wonderful lecture. And people left comments on our YouTube and Facebook's live streaming video, and I'll leave some comments for you. Someone left a comment. Thank you, Professor, for your lecture. The specific cases helped me understand the heritage interpretation in the context of UNESCO World Heritage. And Grace Bach left comment saying, thank you for your presentation. What will be the role of the site managers on heritage interpretation? I think it might be the first question for today.
Well, this depends, of course, from country to country, site to site. In some cases, site managers are well controlled by the central bureaucracy, heritage bureaucracy, and they have little room to interpret the sites themselves. In others, they have more room. Ideally, there should be discussion between the site manager and the centre, but also with other stakeholders. This gets back to the commentary that Neil was making last week, that this should be inclusive, that visitors have something to say about how sites should be understood, as do local communities and funding agencies on. So it needs to really bring all these things together. Sometimes site managers can run this kind of consultation. Sometimes it's run on the centre. In terms of making things more inclusive and bringing site interpretation into line with the 2015 World Heritage Sustainable Development, this is adding things to the role that site managers have traditionally had. And many site managers, of course, are not trained to do this. They're not trained to deal with human rights issues and gender equity and inclusive economic development and some of these sorts of things. So a good deal of training and promotion of these ideas needs to go on, simply to relieve the burden, but to give them the skills to go ahead with the job.
Yeah, thank you. And I'll give you the second questions people left on our Facebook. This is a question by Shirin Barazakjai on Facebook. The question is, the issue of conflicting and questionable goals of interpretation is addressed by UNESCO, no? The regs say World Heritage Sites cannot promote ethnic or gender prejudices or violence against specific groups, don't they? So how does UNESCO justify religious sites which don't allow access to women or lower castes, or in light of today's racial justice issues, promote ideas of ethnic superiority and colonialism? Were the issues clearly outlined in the guidelines and regs for interpretation?
Well, at the moment, the guidelines are not clear on these issues. This is a very good question. This is, you know, I was involved along with Peter Larson and people also talking in the online lecture series in a few weeks' time. We were involved in drafting the 2015 policy. My brief, this was the peace and security elements, and Peter's was human rights. One of the questions that I asked at the meeting we had in Cottbus in Germany, where we started the drafting, was exactly about the gender issue. And I used the example of Mount Athos in Greece, which is a monastery up in the cliffs of a mountain, very difficult to get to, but only accessible to men. And I said, well, you know, if we're serious about gender equity, would we put this now? I mean, it's already on the World Heritage List, but if it came up now, if we were serious, would we put this on the World Heritage List? And my view, shocked one or two other people in that meeting, was that, you know, we probably shouldn't. I mean, we should be serious about a policy and about the UN World Heritage Sustainable Development Agenda and the SDGs, and not go ahead. Now, if you look at some of the results from last year's World Heritage session in Baku, a site in one of the East Asian countries, only accessible to men, was added to the World Heritage List. In other words, you know, despite the policy, and this is a policy, this is not just rhetoric, you know, UNESCO operates through rhetoric to try and inspire and encourage. But this is a policy, and that being a policy, the states parties to the convention are supposed to abide by it. But despite that, the member states, the states parties, are not. I suspect some of them haven't read the document in detail, and they're allowing things still to go through. Okay? So the operational guidelines need to be tightened up. This is my point before. I don't think they've gone far enough in terms of some of these things. gender equity would be one of the human rights, peace and security are others. So this is the problem. You know, you've still got these state parties going along to World Heritage Committee and voting things that are clearly not in line with the 2015 policy. And one of the difficulties is that, you know, increasingly the delegations that go along to the World Heritage Committee meetings are made up of diplomats and people who are representing government views. They're not heritage specialists, you know, who might have a broader view of a broader principle view rather than simply the national view from the centre. Okay? So this is a work in progress, if you like. I hope we're going to get somewhere with it. It's going to take time.
And thank you for your answer. And there's the next question left by Crystal Buckley. Crystal Buckley left a comment saying, "Thank you. My question is whether these recommendations regarding interpretation are for cultural heritage nominations or properties only, or also for natural world heritage nominations or properties, since these can also have complex human histories?"
Hi, Crystal. Good question. I've been looking at cultural heritage sites, but of course, what you say is correct. You know, and if a natural site is related to a recent conflict, then of course it should come under the same rules. So I would hope that somehow the World Heritage Committee or the World Heritage Centre will take this on and will explore how this might be done with representatives from the IUCNs who are picking up the natural sites and natural environments and cultural heritage. And, you know, why not also look at what's happening in the intangible heritage as well. You know, most of what we do in cultural heritage is intangible anyway, so, you know, it's unfortunate the intangible and tangible are kind of separated in this way, but, you know, maybe we can start bringing them into the discussion as well.
Yeah, thank you for your answer. And the next question is left by Dr. Hyung-kyung Lee. Hyung-kyung Lee says, "Thank you for your wonderful lecture. I would like to ask you about the role of UNESCO. Due to the raising voices of marginalized groups and local communities, the matters about the interpretation of heritage will be more complicated. But UNESCO seems to take rather a passive role of facilitating the communications between diverse groups. Do you think how UNESCO can improve its role of activating the dialogues?"
What was the last sentence?
Do you think how UNESCO can improve its role of activating the dialogues?
Well, UNESCO tries to do that already. I've been involved in some consultative meetings in Asia run by UNESCO, but the difficulty often is that even though you know, we say these are supposed to be meetings with representatives of the community, you get to the meeting and you find that the state party has invited certain people to come representing, we're told, the community. And, you know, I remember one where two representative communities sat in the corner of the room, not at the main table, and they said nothing the whole meeting, and I have no idea whether they went back and reported to a community or not. But, you know, since there was a big conference in Amsterdam in 2003 or 2005, you know, quite a long time ago, where they started UNESCO took on board the idea that you need to have broad consultation with groups, including Indigenous groups and other local community groups. So it's there, it's possible, and UNESCO, if we can talk about UNESCO in that way, and its policy is really to try and have inclusive discussions. We just have to keep putting the pressure on, particularly pressure on the States Parties Convention to actually be serious about this and to stop trying to control things from the top. Of course, if you get more inclusive consultation, you do, as you say, get a more complicated interpretation of a site. But that's life. I mean, of course, as Neil said last week, there's many interpretations of sites as there are visitors, Somehow we've got to bring this together. There are, however, some limitations. There are some groups that might be operating according to ideas that are out of line completely with the principles of the UN and the 2015 policy. They might be racist groups, for instance. So there are some groups that you might say are not eligible to be part of your inclusive consultation. But otherwise, let's be as broad as we can and try and deal with this, to try and give them much more multi-layered, complex understanding of sites. And this means the interpretation will be more sophisticated. It's got to remain accessible to all the visitors. It can't be too complicated. You can't let all the social scientists get in there with all the jargon and so on that the ordinary people are not going to understand always. I barely understand it myself most of the time. So, you've got to be a little bit careful. It means that the presentation has got to be much more multi-layered as well. You've got to get into many more techniques that are appropriate to different groups of visitors, whether they're online visitors or visitors in person, according to their ages, according to their level of technical interest in a site, rather than just giving one brochure or, a sign on the site. You've got to do much more than that to get this more complicated interpretation and presentation of heritage sites.
Thank you. Due to lack of time, I think that's all for today's lecture. And we highly appreciate for your wonderful lecture and Q&As with the questions the people left on our Facebook and YouTube channel. Thank you, Dr. William Logan, for your wonderful lecture. And
thank you. My pleasure.
Thank you. It was a great pleasure to have you on our lecture series. The next lecture will be on 7 October, Wednesday. The third lecture under the agenda, World Heritage Interpretation for Cultural Reconciliation, will be on 7 October. The lecturer for the third lecture is Dr. Shumei Huang. It will be held at the same time, 3 p.m. KST and 8 a.m. CET. Please check the Facebook channel of the Preparatory Office for further information on the lecture series. Thanks again for joining us today, and I hope to see you all at the next lecture. Thank you.